All right, so today we are going to be wading into some difficult waters with Martin Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art. And if you read through the essay, you'll see that the text is quite difficult to understand, and the struggle to understand it is a part of what the essay, I believe, is attempting to accomplish. And hopefully we can flesh that out a little bit more as we work our way through, and that this lecture will provide you with some guidance in making your way through this rather difficult text. So I just want to mention real quickly the sources that I'm using for this. They're pretty scanty. I spent the time with the reading itself, The Origin of the Work of Art. There are quite a few quotes from the text in the lecture itself. I also made use of Ian Thompson's Heidegger's Aesthetics from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I think this is an excellent piece on Heidegger's aesthetics, and so if you want to check that out and read through that for some further understanding, I do recommend that, and I have relied on Thompson throughout various portions of this lecture. So not only is the text, The Origin of the Work of Art, a difficult text to comprehend, but Heidegger's biography is actually a little bit difficult to navigate as well, and we'll see why in just a moment. So here's Heidegger's dates, 1889 to 1976. Heidegger was born in Meßkirch, a small town on the edge of the Black Forest in Germany. And Heidegger's original intention was to enter the priesthood. In fact, in 1909, he entered the Jesuit novitiate, but he eventually withdrew after only 2 weeks, apparently, due to poor health. And he would subsequently enroll in university, and there he would encounter the works of Franz Brentano, a very influential thinker on Heidegger, but also Soren Kierkegaard, Wilhelm Dilthey's hermeneutics, and the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. In fact, Edmund Husserl's phenomenology would become pivotal for Heidegger. Heidegger would become a student of Husserl and take up his phenomenology, but then ultimately depart from it in certain significant ways. So eventually Heidegger receives his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Freiburg, where he there worked as an assistant to Husserl. Okay, so far so good. In 1927, he publishes his magnum opus, Being and Time. Sein und Zeit. And this text is arguably one of the most influential works of philosophy in the 20th century. It's still read in university and philosophy classes across the world, usually in existentialism courses, but the impact that Heidegger has had on the contemporary philosophical tradition, whatever you think of Heidegger, some people hate him, think he is too obscure, other people love him and are devout students, other people are, somewhere in the middle. Being in Time is a hugely influential text, and we'll look at some of its major themes in just a little bit. Now, here's where things really start to get difficult. In 1933, Heidegger is appointed rector of Marburg. So at first that sounds great, but he's appointed essentially by the National Socialist Party. So Heidegger essentially becomes a Nazi. He supports the National Socialist movement and gives lectures to the National Socialist Party with Nazi flags hanging in the auditorium, and is using the material that he has written in Being in Time to lend credence to the National Socialist Party. And now there's some debate about Heidegger's involvement in the removal of his Jewish colleagues from their posts at the university. Husserl, for instance, was Jewish, and he was removed from the university because he was Jewish. And there's some debate about how active Heidegger was in that. It appears that Heidegger wasn't directly involved, but he certainly didn't protest or raise much concern about the fact that his Jewish colleagues were being removed, which is very unfortunate. And many of Heidegger's students also couldn't understand why Heidegger made this move. And Heidegger, even in his later life, never gives a full condemnation of his own actions in terms of his involvement with the National Socialist Party, and this is disconcerting to many people, and understandably so. So he's banned from teaching after the denazification hearings of 1945, but eventually he comes to be reinstated in 1950. So this is a major difficulty in dealing with Heidegger, is just the fact. It's well established that Heidegger was in fact a Nazi, and he thought that some of the themes of his own philosophy supported that ideology. Now, it's important for us to realize that just because Heidegger thought that that was the case doesn't mean that in studying his philosophy that we are studying the ideology of the National Socialists. But it is important to keep in mind this historical context. As I've said, Heidegger's work is still studied across universities today, and it is Being in Time is a hugely influential work along with Heidegger's other works. Heidegger is still very much a thinker who is relevant to our own times, and we have to kind of walk a careful line when reading Heidegger and understand that this is a part of the context in which Heidegger's philosophy was originated. And there are even some passages in The Origin of the Work of Art where you kind of get the sense that he still is thinking about National Socialism, that he does have in mind some of the ideology of National Socialism. It's not scattered, doesn't hit you over the head, but you can sort of read between the lines and see what Heidegger is doing in some places. So let's begin by looking at some of the major themes of Being in Time, and this will help lay some of the groundwork for what Heidegger is doing in The Origin of the Work of Art. So in Being in Time, Heidegger is attempting to answer this question: what is the meaning of being? And Heidegger thinks that this is essentially the most basic question we can ask. And given that it is so basic, it's also incredibly elusive. The answer to this question can very easily elude our understanding because of how essential being is to being human, to being a human being. And striving to understand being itself is essential to being a human being. So for Heidegger, we all have this implicit sense of what beings are and what being is generally. But as I was saying earlier, it's very elusive to us. If we were put to the task of explaining what beings are or what being is, we would be hard put to give a coherent account of the nature of being. And this is precisely what Heidegger is attempting to do. He's attempting to develop what he calls a fundamental ontology, a fundamental account of being, which will draw upon the implicit understanding of being that we have as human beings and develop this into a philosophical system. So we all have a basic understanding of being. Heidegger calls this a pre-ontological understanding of being. This is an understanding of being that we have before we actually get any philosophy. And of course, if a philosopher were to come along and ask us about our account of being, we would be hard-pressed to give it. But Heidegger thinks that we show our understanding of being in our basic modes of living. So for Heidegger, our basic mode of understanding being is a practical mode of engagement with the world, a kind of knowing how rather than a knowing that. So Heidegger thinks that we demonstrate our understanding of being by the way in which we engage in the world, the practical knowledge that we have of how the world works. When we get up in the morning and we get ready, we go to work, we engage in our daily tasks, we have leisure time with friends and family. All of these involve a basic pre-ontological understanding of being that we manifest in our practical modes of engagement. It's only later on that we begin to think about things propositionally in terms of abstract theoretical knowledge. Our basic mode of engagement with the world is practical. In fact, Heidegger is going to use this pre-ontological understanding of being as the basis for developing his fundamental ontology. And so in a sense, this is going to be a departure from the traditional philosophical project. What Heidegger is going to use as his basic starting point is the practical modes of engagement that we all find ourselves engaged in, whether we're philosophers or not. In fact, Heidegger has a pretty serious critique of Western philosophy, but in particular Western metaphysics. And of course, there have been many different ways of understanding what Heidegger calls the being of beings, or the being that underlies all particular beings. Heidegger says, look, there have been many different ways of understanding what the being of beings is in the Western tradition. We have accounts of God as the being of beings, or Leibnizian monads, or Kantian things in themselves. There have been all of these philosophical attempts to try to understand the nature of being. And Heidegger thinks that while all of these accounts have been, in their own sense, illuminating, they all have rested on a kind of fundamental distortion of the nature of being itself, which has led Western philosophy astray. And all of these accounts, according to Heidegger, in one way or another, rely on the subject-object dichotomy. So this is the idea that reality consists of a vast aggregate of objects that are fundamentally distinct from knowing subjects or minds. So there's the subject of knowledge, and there is the object of that knowledge. And Heidegger sees this distinction between the subject and object as permeating the entire Western metaphysical tradition. And Heidegger thinks that this results in some serious misunderstanding. And we'll see Heidegger throughout the origin of the work of art critiquing this notion of substance ontology. And this is the idea that reality is composed essentially of substances and accidents. So a substance is what a thing fundamentally is, and the accidents of that thing are the properties that it happens to have. So you might think that a piece of matter, for instance, has a substance, like Descartes thought, of extension. Descartes thought this was the fundamental nature of matter, is to be extended. And it might have all of these accidental properties that accrue to it, like its shape or its color or its smell. But all of these are not essential to the substance. They are the accidents. And there is even here a kind of subject-object dichotomy, the thing itself and then all of the properties which accrue to the thing. For Heidegger, this subject-object dichotomy, in particular the way in which it influences substance ontology, becomes the dominant understanding of reality in contemporary life. And it emerges most clearly in its present form with the modern technological scientific worldview. The idea here is that we are subjective beings, minds or brains, who form representations of objects out there in the world in our minds, and then we have to check to make sure that the representations in our subjective minds really do match up with how those objects actually exist out there in the world. And so we, as modern subjects, have to kind of make this bridge from our own subjectivity, our own subjective point of view on the world, out there to the things themselves, the objects which exist independently of us. And Heidegger thinks that this understanding of being results in an objectification of reality. That is, we begin to think of reality as an object. And that object is fundamentally different from our own subjectivity. So while we, as subjective agents, might be interested in things like meaning and value, objects themselves don't have those properties. So this makes it difficult or downright impossible to account for meaning and value. Under this view, meaning and value, if they exist at all, don't exist in the objective world. They're not in objects themselves, but are merely projections of our own subjective concerns. And this gives rise to relativism about meaning. Relativism about meaning makes it such that there is no stable standard for what is meaningful and what is not. And if there is no standard for what is meaningful and what isn't, then individuals are left to follow their own particular preferences with no guidance as to what is meaningful or what isn't. And this results in a loss of meaning, a crisis of meaning. And this is largely what Heidegger is responding to. So this subject-object dichotomy, which results in the objectification of reality, is contained within our theoretical attitudes. These are the attitudes that we take when we step back from our immediate and practical engagement with things in the world and we adopt this subject-object schema. So when we are reasoning from the theoretical attitude, we are in essence taking a kind of God's eye view on things. We are removing ourselves from our immediate involvement with objects and thinking about the world in an objective way. So we have to use the subject-object schema in order to think this way. And Heidegger thinks that this theoretical mode of understanding is good for many things. Heidegger isn't anti-technology per se or anti-science per se. He thinks that this is a very useful way of understanding certain dimensions of our world. The problem is when we think that this theoretical attitude really tells us about how the world is itself. In fact, Heidegger has this term, forgetfulness, that he thinks this worldview that engenders in us. It produces in us a kind of forgetfulness of a more primordial way of understanding being. Not only does it cause us to forget a more fundamental mode of engagement that we have with the world, it also causes being to conceal itself. So Heidegger has this interesting notion that being will attempt to hide itself from us. And in particular, under this subject-object schema or embedded within this theoretical attitude, if we take that as the fundamental way of knowing being, that will cause the more essential and primordial modes of being to recede from us. In fact, in the origin of the work of art, Heidegger will talk about this worldview as doing a kind of violence or damage to being. It's a kind of aggression that we impose upon things, and it's reflective of our desire to master or conquer the things of our world. So when the world is really just a collection of objects fundamentally distinct from ourselves, which contains no meaning or value, then these objects can become a kind of resource. And the sole pursuit of the Western technological point of view for Heidegger is figuring out how to master it and conquer it. And he sees this as giving rise to very serious problems. We can think of ecological disaster and crisis, this thinking of the environment as a resource, a collection of objects for us to use as subjects who have their own particular concerns, irregardless of the objects around them. So Heidegger thinks this is a real problem, and it's a problem for philosophy too. When the theoretical attitude becomes the dominant mode of knowing, then more nuanced forms of philosophical engagement become obscured from us. In particular, what Heidegger thinks happens is that the very conditions that allow for a world to show up to us at all, this is what he calls worldhood, begin to become obscure to us. That is, we don't understand the primordial origin out of which this subject-object schema arises. We just think the subject-object schema is how things are, and we lose sight of what is really making the appearance of the world in this way possible to begin with. So Heidegger has this notion of being as a coming into being, as being unveiling itself or showing itself. It is a more primordial mode of being. And the way to overcome forgetfulness is to recover this primordial being, which is the hidden ground and meaning of what ordinarily shows up in the world. And to do this, we have to set aside the theoretical attitude, the subject-object schema, and begin to attend to how things show up in our practical life world. That is, how things really do show up to us in our practical mode of engagement with the world. Not the way in which things show up to us in our theoretical attitude, where we're trying to be philosophers or scientists, but how things show themselves to us in a phenomenology of everydayness. This is going to be Heidegger's starting point. So where Heidegger begins is with human being, our mode of being, which is pre-ontological, pre-reflective. And he calls this Dasein, or being there. A word that you see in Heidegger a lot is this hyphenated being in the world. And this is an attempt to deflate the subject-object schema by showing that the boundary between the self is, in our practical engagement with the world, more porous and fluid than the theoretical attitude would have us suppose. So to start with Dasein, with being there, we can see what mode of being underlies our practical engagement with the world. And Heidegger thinks that the way in which we normally encounter beings is not as theoretical objects, but rather as what he calls equipment, in which entities have this character of what he says is readiness to hand. That is, when things are going well in our world, entities are encountered as available for use. So you might think of driving a car, for instance. You wake up, you drive your car to work, and you encountered that being as wrapped up in all these other activities that you are a part of. And the way in which the car shows itself to you is as this being which is available for use to help you get to work. Or you might think of the project of building a bookshelf. So you buy the bookshelf and you have to assemble it. And you have the hammer and the nails and so forth. And the hammer shows itself to you as an object which is available to be used, to help you construct the bookcase. And what Heidegger says is that the world is actually arranged around our projects as agents. So what we are attempting to do in the world actually gives beings their meaning. Now, this is not the same thing as saying that we project our subjective meaning onto the objects, these lifeless objects in our world, but literally that the beings in our world show themselves as they are due to the type of projects that we have undertaken. The world is a functional web of interrelations organized around a purpose. And this is what allows anything to show up as meaningful at all. Now, of course, when we are involved with the world and the equipmental being of that world, as Heidegger will sometimes put it, we're not thinking about how the object is showing up to us as meaningful. It just shows up as meaningful. That is how we encounter it in our ordinary phenomenology. We only begin to explicitly attend to this equipmental character of equipment when there's a breakdown. So, for instance, you drive your car to work and one morning you turn the engine and the engine doesn't start. And now suddenly there is a problem, there is a breakdown. And it's in this moment that the theoretical attitude begins to kick in. We have to begin thinking, what has gone wrong? What's going on in the object? I need to get this to a mechanic so that they can figure out what the problem is and fix it. But in this state, we have been removed from the more primordial engagement we have with the object, where when we're taking the car to work, we're not thinking of the car as some theoretical object. It's really a part of our life world, a part of what gives meaning to our life. And so there isn't this sharp boundary between subject and object in this. In our practical engagement with things, there's a fluid relationship between self and object. There's no hard and fundamental divide. And you can think of the same thing with the bookshelf. You're putting the bookshelf together, things are going well, but suddenly you realize that you don't have one of the essential parts to put the bookshelf together totally. And now you have to figure out, you have to problem solve, you have to think about things more theoretically. But this isn't the primary mode of being. This is actually derivative of our practical engagement with things. So Heidegger thinks that meaning and value are not things that we project out there from our subjectivity onto lifeless objects. Our involvement with things is itself a meaning-filled context in which the projects that we take up allow beings to show up as they are. It's not that we are projecting our own subjective meanings onto things, but that things really are showing up as meaningful because of the projects that we've undertaken. So this is what Heidegger will sometimes refer to as skillful comportment to what is ready to hand. Let's take an example. If you're an artist, for instance, let's say you are a musician and you've been doing this for some time. You are skillfully comported to what is ready to hand. You have your musical instrument, which is almost like an extension of one of your own limbs. When you get up for your performance, you know how the speakers should sound. You have a feel for the entire context and world in which your music making and music playing occurs. The things which are in that world are not objects that are distinct and hardly separated from you, but really are extensions of the project that you've undertaken. You know what to do with the musical instrument in your hands. You know how to relate to the audience which has come to listen to you play. You know how the subtle movements of your bandmates reflect the direction in which the music is going to go, and so forth. You are a part of this meaning-filled context, and being skillfully comported to the beings within that world or within that context is in fact what Heidegger calls understanding. So our understanding is this skillful comportment to what is ready to hand. And one and one's own being is defined by this understanding. For instance, one can be an artist, can be this kind of person because of the interrelated network of beings and relations that constitute that world. The self and the world belong to each other, and our world is defined in this interrelationship. So again, this is what Heidegger calls being in the world. Self and world belong to each other. They are, in fact, a single entity. And Heidegger will sometimes refer to Dasein, human being, or being there, as a clearing or a lighting. And what Heidegger means by this is that the way in which an entity shows up to us is only possible when Dasein creates a clearing, an ability for that being to show itself as it is. So this is a part of the fundamental mode of being, is that our skillful comportment to the ready to hand creates a clearing or a lighting in which beings can show themselves as they are. If we go back to our example of a musician, we might think of an instance where a musician is skillfully engaged in their art in front of an audience, and just very subtle shifts in atmosphere will indicate to the musicians the direction in which they should take their music. So there might be a just almost imperceptible shift in atmosphere, which the musician is able to pick up on, which allows them to move with the world of the audience and the music that they are involved in. But also importantly for Heidegger, Dasein also requires concealment. And we saw this notion of concealment come up with the subject-object dichotomy. This causes being to hide itself, and that's true for Heidegger, but it's also true that concealment is in fact an essential feature for beings to show up as meaningful in the first place. So in order for things to show up as meaningful for Heidegger, we can't be focused on that worldhood, on that background that makes the appearance of the world possible to begin with. So if you're a musician, for instance, it's not that you are directly focused on all these particular dimensions of your world. You are involved with them. So in some sense, you're not even explicitly thinking about them in your involvement. So this is similar to the way in which, for instance, in order to see the flowers in a field, one can't be staring directly at the sun. They can't be staring directly at the source of illumination. Similarly, in our practical involvement with the world, we are not actively engaged in paying attention to where this world is arising from or how it is arising. We have to, in some sense, not be paying attention for that in order for the world to appear as it is. And this notion of concealment will actually become quite important for Heidegger in terms of what the work of art is doing. The concealment of a being is an essential feature of the unconcealment of that being. So something, in order for something to appear as it is, there also has to be a dimension of it that is hidden. All right, so let's start digging into the essay itself. The Origin of the Work of Art is an essay that Heidegger delivered repeatedly between 1935 and 1936. And through the various iterations of delivering this lecture, he eventually penned this essay. And one way of thinking about what Heidegger is doing in this essay is that he's critiquing the traditional conception of aesthetics. And if we think back to the critique of Western metaphysics that we were referencing earlier, Heidegger thought that the subject-object dichotomy that is taken up in the theoretical stance, which is a result from the breakdown of our practical engagement with the world and adopting this view that the self is fundamentally distinct from objects out there in the world, that this led to a distortion. Through this mode, we have access to being as it really is, and Heidegger thought that that was a mistake. He also sees that view infecting aesthetics. And the idea for Heidegger is that, well, when we think about the artwork as the object that the subject, the viewer, you or me, encounters, we're already within that mode of the subject-object dichotomy where we have some subject who makes judgments about beautiful objects. And usually that occurs through some kind of feeling relation between the artwork and the subject. But for Heidegger, this is precisely the problem with Western metaphysics, and it shows up also in aesthetics, in our understanding of art. Heidegger will influence the historical dimension of art, what he calls its historicity, the doctrine according to which our fundamental sense of reality changes over time. For Heidegger, the artwork is in some sense a living being, which is fundamentally connected to the viewer. So just as Heidegger thought that the self and the world are not fundamentally distinct and separate things, rather the boundary between self and world is porous, ambiguous, and not really there within our practical mode of engagement, so Heidegger thinks that the connection that a historical community has to a work of art is they're fundamentally bound up with each other, and it doesn't make sense to think of an artwork separate from the historical understanding that a people has of themselves. And we'll start to look at this historical dimension of art that Heidegger sees within the work of art a little bit further as we move through the lecture. The traditional conception of the branches of philosophy put beauty in the domain of aesthetics. So if we're thinking about beauty, then we're doing aesthetics. If we want to think about truth, on the other hand, then we shouldn't be doing aesthetics. We should be doing logic or epistemology. And Heidegger thinks that this is another result of the subject-object dichotomy, which has distorted our conception of being. So the idea is this: look, if we're thinking about truth, there is this relationship between the subject and the object. And what we want to know in the case of logic or epistemology is, does our proposition accurately correspond to something out there in the world? And that is something for logic and epistemology to decide. Aesthetics really has nothing to say about that. What aesthetics can tell us about is the feeling of beauty. What is the relationship between the viewer and the work of art, the subject and the work of art, some kind of feeling relation in which beauty is revealed. And so if you want to know about truth, you go to logic. If you want to know about beauty, you go to aesthetics. And Heidegger is challenging this conception. And as we'll see, Heidegger thinks that truth is contained in the work of art. So Heidegger begins with this question: what is the origin of the work of art? And the first thing that he notes is the meaning of this word origin, Ursprung in German. And he says that an origin is the source from which something is what it is as it is. In other words, the origin is the essential source that gives something its being. And the question that Heidegger wants to ask is, what is the origin of the work of art? And he thinks that under the traditional conception of aesthetics, if we're asking what's the origin of the work of art, the traditional response is to say, well, it's the artist. In particular, the artist's subjectivity, which then creates the work of art. That's our standard aesthetic theory. And so, under this traditional conception, art is an object produced from the experiences of the artist. But we know that Heidegger is critical of this traditional framework. And what he does next is ask an interesting question. He says, well, if the artist is the origin of the artwork, what then is the origin of the artist? How does the artist become an artist? And he says the origin of the artist is the work of art. And you can think about the sense in which this is true, because we don't get artists unless there are works of art potentially that can inspire the artist to take up their particular medium and create their work of art. Even on a deeper level, the artwork has to, in some sense, already be present or influence the artist in order for them to be an artist. And so Heidegger is saying, look, if we take the traditional viewpoint, aesthetic viewpoint, where we have the subject, the object, the artist whose experiences give rise to the work of art, and we say the artist is the origin of the artwork, well, it makes just as much sense to say that the artwork is the origin of the artist. And here we find ourselves in what Heidegger calls a hermeneutical circle. The artist, he writes, is the origin of the work of art. The work is the origin of the artist. Neither is without the other. So already we can see what Heidegger is doing. He's saying, look, you don't get one without the other. They're not as separable as we might like to think with our neat subject-object dichotomy. The artist and the artwork are fundamentally intertwined such that it makes asking this question, what is the origin of the work of art, a much more profound question than Heidegger thinks the aesthetic tradition has recognized. And Heidegger's move here is going to be to say, look, both the artist and the work of art are what they are by virtue of a third thing, namely art. And here, Heidegger's philosophical exploration will begin. He's thinking about art as the origin of both the artist and the artwork. And he asks the question, what is the essence of art? And here Heidegger is asking a metaphysical question. What is the nature of art as such? And we'll see that as Heidegger begins to work out this question, Both artist and artwork are fundamentally contained within this metaphysical notion of art as such. So Heidegger is asking this question, what is the essence of art? The essence of art is going to be the origin of the work of art. But Heidegger is going to have to take a number of steps before he can ask that question. So one of the first aspects that Heidegger is going to explore is the thingy nature of a work of art. He says that works of art are as naturally present as are things. So if we think about this, architecture, we have a building made out of some solid material. There is a thingy nature to the building. Even to the painting hanging on the wall, there is some kind of physical dimension to the work of art which characterizes its being. Heidegger writes on page 145, the picture hangs on the wall like a rifle or a hat. A painting, for example, the one by Van Gogh that represents a pair of peasant shoes, travels from one exhibition to another. Works of art are shipped like coal from the Ruhr and logs from the Black Forest. During the First World War, Hölderlin's hymns were packed in the soldier's knapsack together with cleaning gear. Beethoven quartets lie in the storerooms at the publishing house like potatoes in a cellar. So art has this thing-like nature. Of course, that's not all that we're talking about when we're talking about a work of art. It's not only the thingy nature which is important to us. Heidegger says we say the work of art is in the stone or in the wood. And what this implies is that there is something in the work of art which has been added to its thingy nature. That the thingy nature of the work of art is a basis for something else. He says that it's something other than the mere thing it appears to be. And Heidegger says, look, the work of art is an allegory. He says the work of art makes public something other than itself. It manifests something other. It is an allegory. So if we just look at what the artwork is as it's presenting itself to us, we see a thing. And Heidegger wants to say, yes, it is a thing. It has this thingy basis, but there's also something more. It's manifesting something other. And he references the Greek word symboline, which means a symbol. And in the very ancient Greek tradition, the symboline meant the joining together of a kind of a token which would represent a contract, an agreement. So if you made an agreement with somebody, you might split some object in half. You get one half and the person who you have entered into agreement with gets the other half, and you would both hold on to those as tokens. And when you'd come back together, you would both see, you both have those two pieces, you put them back together as representative of the agreement that you had. So Heidegger is saying, look, something is being joined to the thing here. The work of art is a symbol. So now we have to figure out how the work of art functions as an allegory or a symbol. But Heidegger doesn't want to stray too far away from the thinginess of the work of art, since that is an important feature of how the work of art presents itself to us. And so Heidegger thinks that we need to get clear first on what this thingy nature of the work of art really is. So Heidegger has sort of a funny way of talking about this, and his investigation now is going to be into the thingness of the thing. And he asks this question, what is the thingness of a thing? In other words, what makes a thing a thing? And he reasons that all beings no matter what they are, if they are a being, can be considered a thing. But as he's listing these different sorts of things, he says, well, look, some of these things are better characterized as things than other things. So, for instance, it makes more sense to think of a shoe, an axe, a clock as a thing than God or a teacher teaching a class. We usually don't talk about a teacher teaching a class or a student in a class as a thing, but it makes a whole lot of sense for us to speak of an axe as a thing or a shoe as a thing. So what does it mean for something to be a thing? So if there are these more or less appropriate uses of the word thing to describe things, what is it that we are referring to when we are referring to a thing? And he says, traditionally, there have been three modes under which the thing has been conceived. And what Heidegger will do here is go through each of these different modes and show how all of them have arisen from this mistaken conception of being that we've been talking about so far in the lecture. So the first conception he goes through is the thing as a bearer of traits. The second is the thing as a unity of a manifold of sensations. And the third is the thing as formed matter. And these are three different conceptions that Heidegger thinks have been used to understand the thing, but given that they all to one degree or another rest upon this subject-object dichotomy, they have really obscured the thingness of the thing. So he's going to walk us through each of these and show us how these views are constituted, where they go wrong, and then ultimately we're going to be moving toward a deeper, more primordial conception of the thing, which then Heidegger will have lead us into the thingness of the work of art. So the first view that Heidegger examines here is the thing as a bearer of traits. And the example that he gives us is of a block of granite. And he says, a thing, as everyone thinks he knows, is that around which the properties have assembled. So if we take the block of granite, it is that around which the properties have assembled. So the hardness of the granite, its heaviness, its extendability, its bulkiness. We say the thing has these properties. And sometimes we'll use this phrase, the core of things. So the thing is not merely an aggregate of traits. It is the thing around which the traits have assembled. And Heidegger says the Greeks had a name for this, to hypokaimenon. And it is only in the Roman tradition that the Greek meaning of this term is lost and eventually becomes what we refer to as the substance with its accidents. So Heidegger writes, these designations are no arbitrary names. Something that lies beyond the purview of this essay speaks in them, the basic Greek experience of the being of beings in the sense of presence. So Heidegger is saying, look, this view originally comes into being through the Greek tradition, and there's something in these terms that Heidegger thinks get covered over in the translation to the Roman world. So the hypokaimenon becomes the subjectum. The hypostasis or hypostasis becomes the substantia, and the symbebekota becomes the accidents. So from the Greek tradition, this idea of a thing as a substance is actually quite different than our conception of the substance. Where our conception of the substance with its accidents comes from is when the Roman tradition attempts to translate these Greek terms. And this is where we get the idea that the block of granite isn't the aggregate of its various properties. It is the thing around which those properties assemble, the substance and its accidents. And Heidegger says with this, the notion of being in the Western tradition is stabilized. So this becomes a fundamental way in which being is conceived, a substance with its accidents. So these Roman translations of the Greek concepts, the substance with its accidents, becomes the standard interpretation for our conception of the thing. This is the conception of being that then is brought to bear in all of our thinking of being. And Heidegger thinks that something is lost in this conception. But he does note that this conception of the substance and the accidents, it does kind of match the way in which we encounter things. So when I encounter the block of granite, for instance, I seem to encounter a thing that the properties are assembled around. And it does kind of make sense for me to think of the block of granite as a substance with its particular accidents. So Heidegger is saying, look, this is a reasonable way of understanding being on the face of it, because we appear to have a match between the conception and the way in which things really are. And Heidegger notes that even our language seems to contain this understanding of being. A proposition, for instance, consists of both a subject and a predicate. The subject is the thing of which something is predicated, which mirrors our conception of the substance with its accidents. But Heidegger thinks that this conception of the thing, the subject, predicate, substance, accident view, doesn't really capture the essence of the thing. In fact, what we're doing is overlaying this conception of the thing onto being itself. And it's true that a particular feature of being is picked out by this, but it's not the essence of the thing. Heidegger writes, occasionally we still have the feeling that violence has long been done to the thingy element of things, and that thought has played a part in this violence. So in other words, our thinking about being under this substance accidents schema has done violence to being itself. And he says, for which reason people disavow thought instead of taking pains to make it more thoughtful. So Heidegger is saying we need to think deeper about what the essence of the thing is. The concept of the thing as a bearer of traits doesn't do justice to the essence of the thing. He says, to be sure, the current thing concept always fits each thing. Nevertheless, it does not lay hold of the thing as it is in its own being, but makes an assault upon it. So Heidegger now goes on to consider this second view, the thing as a unity of a manifold of sensations. And he doesn't spend as much time on this, but it's still interesting, the view that Heidegger has here. So Heidegger thinks this is an alternative view which can be used to understand the essence of the thing. And he references this Greek term aistheton, which refers to perception through sensation. So the perception of tones, colors, and textures, for instance, which have a feeling quality or a feeling tone to them. And he says, look, another way of viewing the thing is as a manifold, a unity of a manifold of sensations. So instead of seeing the thing as something around which the properties aggregate, we might think that the thing just is the manifold of sensations that we experience when we encounter it. So, for instance, Heidegger thinks that if I encounter the block of granite, the thinginess of the block of granite is the rough texture that I feel. Maybe the crashing sound that I hear when it falls from a high place. These are the sensations, the perceptible sensations that we encounter when we encounter the thing. And so what this view is suggesting is that it is the sensations, the perception of the sensations that the thing produces, which is its essential nature. So if I want to know about what the thing is, I'll pay attention to how the block of granite feels, for instance, or the texture, the rough texture of the block of granite. But Heidegger wants to say this really isn't how we experience things. When we experience things, we don't experience them as a unity of a manifold of sensations. When I encounter the block of granite, I don't just encounter a rough texture or the coldness of the granite, right? I encounter it as a piece of granite. He says we hear the storm whistling in the chimney, right? We don't just hear the whistling in the chimney, we hear the storm whistling in the chimney. We hear the three-motored plane. That is, we don't just hear the motors, we hear the three-motored plane when we hear that noise. He says we hear the Mercedes in distinction to the Volkswagen. So we could describe the sensations that the thing is producing in us, but Heidegger wants to say, but the thing always seems to be carried with those sensations. And so this view really hasn't done justice to the nature of the thing. He says, much closer to us than all sensations are the things themselves. The thing itself must be allowed to remain in self-containment. It must be accepted in its own steadfastness. So Heidegger thinks this view of the thing also won't do. So the final view that Heidegger considers here is the view that the thing is formed matter. What does Heidegger mean by this? Well, if we take the block of granite, for instance, the block of granite has a form. The form in this particular case is its shape, the distribution and arrangement of the material parts. So the idea here is that the thing is formed matter. There's some basic matter which is pressed into some particular form. Heidegger notes, however, that the block of granite is really not the best example here to give for what this view constitutes. Much more appropriate would be something like an axe or a shoe or some practical item which has some readily applicable use in our everyday lives. So the axe is made out of, let's say, wood and stone, but that wood and stone disappear in the form that that matter takes, in it being pressed into the form of an axe. Or in the case of the leather, it might be a shoe. And what Heidegger wants to say is that in these instances, the form is determining the arrangement of the matter, and in particular its use, how the object then appears to us. And so for Heidegger, the main characteristic of the schema thing as formed matter is the usefulness, is the way in which the being under this conceptual scheme presents itself to us. And Heidegger actually thinks that it's this view which has come to inform aesthetics more than any other. He says the distinction of matter and form is the conceptual schema which is used in the greatest variety of ways quite generally for art theory and aesthetics. So why does he think this? Well, we take any particular work of art, and as Heidegger has already noted, there's a thing element to it. But that's not all that is there. We have some material basis for the work of art, but then it's pressed into some medium, whether that be painting or photography or poetry. You have the pages on which the poetry is written, or even the vocal expression of the words. And in these instances, what we see is that the thing is the formed matter, right? It's the words pressed into a particular metrical verse. And Heidegger wants to say it's the form here which is then enabling that material to present itself or represent itself to us in a particular way. And this is the conception that's used in the widest way within art theory and aesthetics generally. So we've got the thing and its form. The thing is formed matter. And he says form and content are the most hackneyed concepts under which anything and everything may be subsumed. So clearly Heidegger is saying, like, look, this view is far too overused. And it has at its basis the idea that the thing presents itself to us through its form in a useful way, in a way in which we can understand it. So the view is that the thing is formed matter. And Heidegger writes, representation has at its command a conceptual machinery that nothing is capable of withstanding. That is, the view that the thing is formed matter is such a ubiquitous way of understanding art theory and aesthetics that, and even beyond that to being generally, that it's hard to see that there's any other possible way of conceiving the nature of being. So let's look at this view of the thing as formed matter a little bit further. So the view that Heidegger has in mind here is the view that the thing as formed matter gives rise to this conception of the thing as a piece of equipment. So under the conceptual scheme of the thing as formed matter, what comes to dominate the way in which we encounter that being is its usefulness. And so Heidegger writes that that equipment is what is produced expressly for employment and use. And in a very general way, in art theory and aesthetics, the work of art is presented for the experience of the subject. So that is why it is produced. It is produced to, let's say, generate a particular feeling of beauty in the viewing subject, which somehow enriches their life. And that's the type of use that Heidegger sees the work of art under this schema being employed for. And he says, but look, equipment is a very interesting sort of being. Being's being as equipment is an interesting sort of being. Equipment is kind of like the artwork in that it has been formed by human hands. But if we really think about equipment, the artwork itself isn't properly described as a piece of equipment, right? In that there are other objects which more properly can be described in this way, such as axes and shoes and so forth. So the piece of equipment for Heidegger, it lies in between a mere thing and a work of art. The mere thing is like the block of granite or a stone, some inanimate object that hasn't had any human intervention upon it. The work of art has been transformed into something more than a mere thing, but the piece of equipment is sort of in between both of those. The shoe or the axe, it has been formed by human hands, yet at the same time, it still is properly described as a thing. And Heidegger thinks that this conception of the thing as formed matter, in particular the thing as a piece of equipment that can be used, is the scheme which is ubiquitously applied to our understanding of being more generally. In fact, these conceptions of the thing exert such a strong influence on the way in which we think about being, we're going to have to remain vigilant if we really want to explore the true nature of being. We have to remain vigilant that this conception does not encroach upon our thinking and distort our investigation. Heidegger writes, to this end, however, only one element is needful, to keep at a distance all the preconceptions and assaults of the above modes of thought, to leave the thing to rest in its own self, for instance, in its thing being. So the three different ways of conceiving of being. The thing as a bearer of traits, the thing as a unity of a manifold of sensations, and the thing as formed matter. These three modes of understanding the thing so dominate our thinking that we have to be careful that they don't encroach upon our investigation into the essence of the thing, which Heidegger is going to begin exploring now. So the work of art is presented as formed matter in the sense that its form communicates something important for me as the viewing subject. The work of art has its being in, let's say, the type of beautiful feeling that I feel in relation to that work of art. And Heidegger thinks there is something right about all of these views. There's something right in the view that the thing is formed matter, but it doesn't capture the essence of the thing. And we can see it in particular in the work of art. If the work of art just is its being because of the type of feeling it produces in me, Heidegger wants to say, well, we're kind of missing out on the nature of the thing itself, of the nature of the work of art itself. And since these views are so ubiquitous and they do actually capture something correctly, Heidegger thinks that if we explore them just a little bit further and think about them a bit more deeply, we'll see that there is a more essential notion of being that is underlying these types of conceptions that we normally bring to bear on the object. And so what Heidegger is going to do now, he sort of restates the goal of the inquiry here. He says he's going to try to uncover the equipmental quality of equipment. That is, he's going to try and discover what really is the essence of the thing, which is underlying this conception of the thing as formed matter, the thing as equipment. What is that? What is the nature of that thing, which then gives rise to this view that the thing is formed matter? Okay, so I'm going to read just a little bit from the text here to help us kick off this section of Heidegger's investigation here. So this is in the middle of page 158 in the PDF reading that I gave you. But what path leads to the equipmental quality of equipment? How shall we discover what a piece of equipment truly is? The procedure necessary at present must plainly avoid any attempts that again immediately entail the encroachments of the usual interpretations. We are most easily insured against this if we simply describe some equipment without any philosophical theory. So Heidegger is just going to say, let's describe a piece of equipment phenomenologically as it appears to us and see what we are presented with. He says, we choose as example a common sort of equipment, a pair of peasant shoes. We do not even need to exhibit actual pieces of this sort of useful article in order to describe them. Everyone is acquainted with them. But since it is a matter here of direct description, it may be well to facilitate the visual realization of them. For this purpose a pictorial representation suffices. We shall choose a well-known painting by Van Gogh, who painted such shoes several times. But what is there to see here? Everyone knows what shoes consist of. If they are not wooden or bast shoes, there will be leather soles and uppers joined together by thread and nails. Such gear serves to clothe the feet. Depending on the use to which the shoes are to be put, whether for work in the field or for dancing, matter and form will differ. Such statements, no doubt correct, only explicate what we already know. The equipmental quality of equipment consists in its usefulness. But what about this usefulness itself? In conceiving it, do we already conceive along with it the equipmental character of equipment? In order to succeed in doing this, must we not look out for useful equipment in its use? The peasant woman wears her shoes in the field. Only here are they what they are. They are all the more genuinely so, the less the peasant woman thinks about the shoes while she is at work, or looks at them at all, or is even aware of them. She stands and walks in them. That is how shoes actually serve. It is in this process of the use of equipment that we must actually encounter the character of equipment. As long as we only imagine a pair of shoes in general, or simply look at the empty, unused shoes as they merely stand there in the picture, we shall never discover what the equipmental being of the equipment in truth is. From Van Gogh's painting, we cannot even tell where these shoes stand. There is nothing surrounding this pair of peasant shoes, or to which they might belong, only an undefined space. There are not even clods of soil from the field or the field path sticking to them, which would at least hint at their use. A pair of peasant shoes and nothing more. And yet, from the dark opening of the worn insides of the shoes, the toilsome tread of the worker stares forth. In the stiffly rugged heaviness of the shoes, there is the accumulated tenacity of her slow trudge through the far-spreading and ever-uniform furrows of the field swept by a raw wind. On the leather lie the dampness and richness of the soil. Under the soles stretches the loneliness of the field path as evening falls. In the shoes vibrates the silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of the ripening grain, and its unexplained self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field. This equipment is pervaded by uncomplaining worry as to the certainty of bread, the wordless joy of having once more withstood want, the trembling before the impending childbed and shivering at the surrounding menace of death. This equipment belongs to the earth, and it is protected in the world of the peasant woman. From out of this protected belonging, the equipment itself rises to its resting within itself. So what is Heidegger saying here? Yes, the nature of equipment is in the use of that equipment. But something more is going on in that usefulness. When we look at Van Gogh's painting, which we're looking at right now, a pair of shoes, at first we might just see a pair of shoes and nothing more. But Heidegger says if we really attend to the painting, what begins to emerge? We begin to sense the wider context in which those shoes are used. The earth that the peasant woman tills, the long walk home as the day ends, having withstood another day of want. These shoes, for Heidegger, don't just have a particular use for the peasant woman. They are intimately bound to the world in which the peasant woman exists. In fact, the shoes couldn't appear as useful unless they were connected to all of the concerns of the peasant woman. And Heidegger thinks that in order for the peasant woman to actually use these shoes, we're looking at it as a painting, so we're at a bit of a remove here, but for the peasant woman actually using the shoes, she doesn't think about how the shoes fit into this wider context of her world and the meaningfulness of her world. They just show up as useful in that world. But when we really start to investigate the ontological foundations of that usefulness, what we'll see is that those shoes can only appear as useful if they are bound up with this wider context of meaning and significance. And Heidegger is saying that when we attend to Van Gogh's painting here, what is revealing itself to us is this equipmental quality of the equipment, that is, the ontological foundation of this equipment. So let's remember what Heidegger is doing here. He's trying to uncover the equipmental quality of equipment. So again, what does Heidegger mean by that? It means, what is the ontological foundation of the equipment which shows up as useful in our world? How is it that the shoes show themselves as useful? What's the ontological foundation of that? And what Heidegger suggests is that the usefulness of the equipment is grounded in its reliability. Now, Heidegger means something specific here by reliability, something a bit deeper than just usefulness. And in order to explain this reliability, Heidegger introduces two terms here, the earth and the world. And Heidegger will make use of both of these terms throughout the rest of the essay. And he says that the earth is the sheltering or stabilizing condition, whereas the world is the horizon upon which we understand and move. So recall back to the introduction when we were talking about how concealment is a necessary condition for the unconcealment of any being. In other words, in order for any being to show itself as useful in our world, there has to be some element of this being which is not readily apparent to us, which remains concealed, much in the way that Heidegger says that the shoes of the peasant woman don't stand out, that the ontological foundations of that pair of shoes doesn't stand out to the peasant woman explicitly. She forgets about all of that in order for those shoes to serve the role that they do in her world. And this concealing element is what Heidegger refers to as the earth, its reliability, the sheltering, stabilizing condition. It is, in a sense, the unspoken network of interconnections out of which the shoes can show themselves as meaningful. Heidegger writes, this equipment belongs to the earth, and it is protected in the world of the peasant woman. From out of this protected belonging, the equipment itself rises to its resting within itself. So what Heidegger is describing here when he's talking about reliability and the relationship of earth and world are the ontological foundations, the ground out of which this usefulness arises. So to just return to the quote we read a bit from a moment ago, the equipmental being of the equipment consists indeed in its usefulness, but this usefulness itself rests in the abundance of an essential being of the equipment. We call it reliability. By virtue of this reliability, the peasant woman is made privy to the silent call of the earth. By virtue of the reliability of the equipment, she is sure of her world. World and earth exist for her, and for those who are with her in her mode of being, only thus, in the equipment. We say only and therewith fall into error, for the reliability of the equipment first gives to the simple world its security and assures to the earth the freedom of its steady thrust. So Heidegger is introducing some mysterious notions here of world and earth, and we're going to attempt to work those out a bit further in what follows in the rest of the essay. But what we can see here is that Heidegger thinks that what he's doing here is giving a description of the ontological foundations by which the shoes appear as meaningful, as meaningfully present within the peasant woman's world.